Throughout this video, we'll use 5 main measuring tools: a micrometer, a feeler gauge, a steel rule, a telescoping gauge, and a small hole gauge. Let's do a quick review on how to use a micrometer. You first need to select the right size micrometer. For most of our internal parts, it will be the 0 to 1 inch micrometer. I'm going to begin by opening up the micrometer wide enough so the part fits between the spindle and the anvil. Now using the ratchet, I'm going to close down the spindle onto the part until the ratchet ratchets. I'm going to be careful to make sure I'm not crooked on the part so I get an accurate reading. When I feel like I have an accurate reading, I'm going to use the lock to lock the spindle in place. Lastly, I'm going to read my measurement and write it down in my packet. First, I have to decide what size micrometer I'm using. I can find this by looking at the frame of the micrometer. Next, I'll look at the sleeve to see how many tenths my micrometer is reading at. The next thing I need to read is my 25 thousandths. Each one of the tenths is broken down into 4 parts. That gives me 25 thousandths for each mark. Lastly, I have to count my thousandths. This is what is on the thimble. You read thousandths by looking to see what line on the thimble lines up with the line that I highlighted in red. Let's figure out what this 1 inch micrometer reading would be. First, I know it's a 1 inch micrometer, so I'll write that on my paper first. Next, I need to look at the tenths. Because the biggest number that's shown for tenths is 6, I'll write down 6 tenths on my paper. Next, I need to see how many 25 thousandths is showing. Because only one is fully visible, I'm going to write down 25 thousandths on my paper. Lastly, I had to count my thousandths. I looked to see where the line on the sleeve matches the numbers on the thimble and write that down on my paper. This one is at 0 thousandths. Lastly, I had to add up all my numbers. This measurement from the micrometer was 1 inch and 625 thousandths of an inch. Remember, all answers in your packet must have the correct units to be considered correct. Next, we will review how to use a feeler gauge. Feeler gauges are used to accurately measure in between 2 items. They accurately measure to the thousandths of an inch. This one would measure a gap that's 10 thousandths of an inch wide. Here's an example from the packet of using a feeler gauge. It allows us to measure the ring and gap of our piston rings. The next 2 tools that we'll highlight are the telescoping gauge and a small hole gauge. Because micrometers are meant to measure an outside diameter, we need a tool that allows us to measure an inside diameter. This is where the telescoping gauge and small hole gauges come into play. The size of the inside diameter that we're trying to measure will determine whether we use a telescoping gauge or a small hole gauge. Small hole gauges are for measurements that you believe that will be less than half of an inch wide. To use a telescoping gauge, you'll begin by placing the tool within the part you'd like to measure. You'll slightly release the locking screw, allowing the rods to press out against the part, and then locking it back into place. Once the rods are locked into place, you'll wiggle your telescoping gauge out and measure it using a micrometer. Remember to be cautious when using telescoping gauges. If you release the locking screw too much, you'll actually cause permanent damage to the telescoping gauge. The last measuring tool that we'll use is a steel ruler. The steel rule is used when we cannot possibly measure something with the micrometer. Example items would be our valve margin or our valve springs. We'd measure those with our steel rules. From this video, you're sure to learn what all these measuring tools are and what situations you'd use them in.